I want to start by saying that before I became a fan of the film, I was a fan of the book. I have a copy here at home that I've had now for years. I wanted to ask Lizzie first about what brought you to make this book and what inspired it. I mean, because it's an oral history, which is one of my favorite formats. What inspired, what other oral histories inspired it, and what made you think that this was something that had enough mass to be able to support an oral history?
First of all, thanks for hanging on to the book for all these years now. I'll start with other oral histories. I mean, obviously, Please Kill Me. Please Kill Me is the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to music, to rock and roll oral histories. And also, I think really showed me the way in which a kind of close look at a subculture can tell in telling that story well, can tell a broader cultural history at the same time. For me, coming to New York in my teens, really, and starting to see bands and stuff, Please Kill Me was the book that when you heard somebody else say that they had a copy, or you saw a copy in somebody's apartment, it was this sort of sign of you'd found your people. And the goal with Meet Me in the Bathroom very explicitly from the beginning was, let's do that for our era. Like, is it possible to do that for our era? If you could ever create a reality where kids are coming to New York using Meet Me in the Bathroom as the same kind of talisman of like shared sensibilities, that was the goal. I would also say Edie. I think Edie is...
I own that too.
It's not a big shocker. These are not like super deep cut, like genius oral histories, but those are the two that I would say like most influenced my sense of how I wanted this book to work. And then in terms of the idea for the book, like, it's really great serendipity, because for the couple of days that I realized that I wanted to write something about this time, I didn't yet know that I was going to do it as an oral history, but I went and saw the then final LCD Sound System show at the Madison Square Garden. And I also, in the same couple nights or couple day period, saw the Strokes play MSG for the first time. And it was a very clear, those experiences left a really clear mark of this notion that there were now bookends on this time, that these bands that I had started coming up with in the early 2000s and knew about in the early 2000s. I mean, LCD is a little later, but that me and my friends, for lack of a better description, people I actually knew, bands that I saw in what felt like an alternate universe from the actual mainstream rock and roll world, from any world where Madison Square Garden would be like on your tour list, on your list of venues you were playing, that had changed. And now these bands were part of that thing. This sort of, they were not mainstream exactly, but sort of like part of a bigger popular consciousness, and that something had ended, not in a bad way, but that was a kind of, it just seemed like a marking of time, 2001 to 2011. And of course, Will and Dylan were making a film about that very show. So, or, would go and make this film, Shut Up and Play the Hits, which I then saw and loved. And so I think there's a kind of cool continuity between, I mean, it's obviously accidental, but it's nice to think about between the sort of inception point for me of why this book needed to be written, and that this time period existed, that this time period had a shape to it, and the writing of the book, and now the being here speaking to you about the making of a film, that that these guys were also connected to that very same moment in the way that I was.
So as directors, how did you identify this as a property that you thought had the capacity to be, translated into film as a documentary?
I think that another kind of serendipitous thing was our friend worked at the publishers who were publishing it in the UK, and we managed to get hold of the galleys of it before it was released in the UK. So we'd read it, and it'd be hard to imagine not reading that book and being excited about, if you're a filmmaker, excited about the potential of bringing it to the screen. I think the biggest thing is that we were daunted, because, it's a big tome and it covers a decade, and a sort of feature documentary doesn't give you the kind of purview to explore that whole kind of 10 years. So we initially pitched it as a 4-part series to various streamers who all really liked it, but it never quite worked out that way. So we then kind of fell in love with the idea of doing it as a film. The trickiest thing was, what do we include that's in the book? How do we make it not just a kind of like for like transfer of the book to the screen? How do we make the film its own thing and lean into what filmmaking gives us that the book doesn't have? So yeah, we knew that there was great potential in it. We knew that we would have to make something that was fairly immersive, because the thing that appealed to us was that looking back at it, it's so we hit that. It was that point in your life where you're suddenly like, oh my God, that was 20 years ago. And it feels like it was yesterday. So it was like, we just looked at how different the world was then. And our big thing was, we don't want to make a behind the music. We don't want to make something that feels too retrospective, that has talking heads, interviews, or too much cultural commentary. We just wanted to drop people into the time and let the story unfold the way it does in the book. So that was the challenge. And kind of how we met it unfolded over the following years.
I honestly think reading the book, it was such a kind of blast reading the book. It's, it's a page turner. You introduced all these characters, some of whom you're aware of, some of whom you're not aware of. And it felt like immediately you're in that moment in time. And I guess that's what we wanted to do with the film, do that visually, take a section of that story and like the early part of that story and make a film that had that same feeling. How
was it in terms of getting people to participate? I mean, it's like, actually, I'll ask that as for both of you. For Lizzie, like what kind of challenges did you have in terms of getting all of those voices to participate? And did that, and for the filmmakers, what was it like in terms of getting those voices to weigh, to weigh in again? Is like, was it easier because they had done the book, or was it harder because they didn't want to revisit it? What was the process?
Probably both, I would guess. I mean, I'll defer to these guys on their answer for that part. I mean, for me, I would say I had the advantage and the disadvantage of no one thinking that it would matter. So, and the sort of scope of time. I mean, for a lot of the key players in Meet Me in the Bathroom, there was, when I was interviewing them, there were, they're either people I knew personally or had interviewed a lot before, just through my work as a journalist during the time. And it was easy to kind of say, and authentically, because I was also had no idea what was really going to become of all this. I mean, I knew I was going to write a book, but I didn't know how it was going to come out. It was sort of like, hey, can I get an hour with you when you're in town next month? This, and then I would kind of interview them, a lot of key voices, several times over the course of several years. And every time it really did it'd sort of be like these people, a lot of these sources and I would both be used to a format in which it's like, oh, this is for a piece of journalism coming out next month. And because that wasn't there, I would kind of get like Albert saying, what's this for again? You're writing a book. There's this sort of complete mystery about where this would ever appear. And for me too, I'm like, yeah, I know. And he's like, haven't you been writing that for 5 years? I mean, people would say that, not just him, lots of people. And that was true. So it felt quite like cloistered and private, and almost like these kind of weird that these conversations were going into a vault and that no one knew what would ever become of them. And I think that was a huge advantage in some ways, but then it obviously for the purposes of like people telling the truth and like kind of getting comfortable and feeling a sense of expansiveness about this story and privacy about it. But it was also really hard to get to people. I mean, outside of people I knew personally, because it was just me and there was no, oh, this is for a piece of journalism or this is for a thing you're going to have heard of any kind. It was tough. Like, and there are a lot of people they're not, I mean, there's only Carlos D from Interpol, who's an old friend of mine. And he very respectfully declined to participate and Meet Me in the Bathroom, which is fine. But I would say he's the main one that like keeps me up at night still, just being like, it's not a complete set. We don't have all the, other than that, there really were a lot of voices that I think it would have been useful to have and fun to have that either didn't participate or took so long to get to that, there's sort of a natural rhythm of how that shapes the story. So that was tough. Like I had to do a lot of pavement pounding and a lot of convincing people to just like do me a favor and introduce me to someone else. And can I stalk this person to their coffee shop in the morning? Like a lot of that.
In terms, so like, as you say, you had the sort of ignorance is bliss element, and because it wasn't for an article and it was sort of this thingy that seemed to go on forever. And that can kind of make people feel more open. And, like the Joan Didion quote that, a writer always runs counter to your best interests. And it's like, so, but for the filmmakers, you guys didn't have the element of surprise. It's like, everybody knows what the book is. everybody, has an idea of what a movie could be. So what was it like for you in terms of creating that participation going forward?
Yeah, so we had a different set of problems in that, the book at the start of the project, the book was more recent than it is now. So a lot of people felt like they'd been participants in this project or in this story relatively recently. So there's a little bit of pushback. And like any documentary, there's diplomacy work to be done, and there's kind of, ways to reach out. But our first instinct was to just gather up all the contemporaneous interviews that we could find. And we, luckily being in London during lockdown, we could get in touch with like music journalists who'd kind of done interviews back in 2001, 2002. So we were able to build a lot of the story from interviews from the time, which was useful in kind of giving us that bed that makes it feel like we've dropped the viewer into that time period. And then, slowly but surely, we got the bands who would get involved. We also did interviews that didn't make it in, because part of the process of getting a book that spans 10 years and covers so many different, things into a 90-minute or 100-minute film meant that, we had to pick and choose who we wanted and who made the cleanest story. So, there are a lot of people that came on board as they did for the book that sadly didn't make it into the film. But that's one of the things we think is great. Like if the film's its own thing, but it can also whet people's appetite if they haven't read the book, and vice versa. I think they're both doing very different things, but mostly people were happy to come back and talk to us. But, we made sure it was very focused for them, and we kind of built the story before, bombarding them with loads of questions and wasting their time. So, but we wanted it to feel fresh, and that's why we didn't want to kind of retread too much. So when we finally did do interviews, it was kind of a very surgical approach. It was just to fill the gaps that we were missing.
When did you make the decision to not have actual talking heads? I mean, that's always a really important decision for any documentary filmmaker to do. And I would imagine has additional challenges attached to it. So what was that thinking for you guys?
It definitely makes it more tricky, sure. I think we always kind of felt to keep
it was very early on.
Yeah, exactly. To keep people in the moment and to make a kind of document of that time, it's better not to cut people now talking about it, because it will take you out of the world. And then I think that kind of idea was solidified by us not being able to leave London and go to New York to a film interview, and so it was a sort of ambition at the start, and then that, and it's turned out that way, and I think better for it, for sure.
Were all the interviews that you did for the film, did any of them come from Lizzie's work, or were they all original to the film?
So it's a combination, really. So there's contemporaneous interviews from 2001, 2002. There are new interviews that we did with the bands, and then at certain points there were bits of Lizzie interviews that we used. So what we really loved with the film was being able to embrace a kind of, almost like the aesthetic of the time, which is very collaged. And we loved working with the old DV camera footage, and it felt like to assemble this story, you had permission because of the aesthetic of the scene and the aesthetic of the time to really collage it and create something that's, a document of the time, but pulled from all of these amazing sources.
Lizzie, do you feel like the period that you captured in Meet Me in the Bathroom, do you think that this is, Please Kill Me was of its own specific time, Meet Me in the Bathroom was of its own specific time? Do you feel like there's the opportunity for more stories like this going forward? Because obviously music continues to evolve and cultures continue to evolve. But the thing that's different is in those previous times, people weren't observing themselves as much. You didn't have you didn't have the constant onslaught of social media and selfies and all the kind of elements that sort of beat writers like you to the punch. You know what I mean? And on top of that, it heightens their awareness of what it means when a writer comes calling.
I'm just laughing because that's a very diplomatic way of putting our collective self-obsession these days. I mean, it's like Yes. The first thing that comes to mind to say is that it's definitely to the advantage. We have talked a lot in the making of this film and in the sort of lead up to deciding to work together on this project in the first place about the sort of the specificity of that time. And if you think of all, coming of age stories are Madame Bovary. Where am I getting this? Flaubert. Like all families are happy and unhappy in the same way.
Yes.
Like coming of age
right.
stories are all, the same and completely different in their own way. I mean, there's my English professors are like howling somewhere at the moment. But there's a kind of the DNA of the coming of age story is kind of fundamental and timeless. And then also every time it happens in its own unique way. And I think that's always true. And it's certainly true for our particular coming of age story, which is definitely how I thought of this period and how I know Will and Dylan have conceived of elements of their storytelling too, as it pertains to this period. So in that sense, it's like, no, of course it's going to happen again. I mean, there's, but to your point, part of the specificity of our particular coming of age story is the ending of one thing and the beginning of something else, the kind of like sliding doors moment between the 20th century and the 21st century. And because of the political, cultural, and social changes that just happened to go down during that period of time, it's an extraordinarily like tectonic shift, unrecognizable from 1 hour to the next, sometimes sort of era. And so for this story, for this particular coming of age story, those themes are just really rich because it's like such a dramatic change. Like I thought a lot when I was writing the book about the difference between Julian and Ezra from Vampire Weekend, and that it's like a half a generation, like not very many years at all, maybe 5 or 6 years between those guys, but that one of them had to go looking for television records and the other one could download all of Kate Bush, Public Enemy, and like Kraftwerk on LimeWire in their basement growing up, and that just the sort of like the way that micro example of two people explains this entire cultural shift and how artists are the artists that are coming up right behind the artists we're covering are completely different animals from the ones who preceded them. So yeah, I mean, I think we got, those of us who want to tell a story about this time have a lot to work with because there's so many, it's such an obviously rich period of time to have been doing something that every generation does, which is like figure out how to be young, chase the things you want, make mistakes, do drugs, have art. So to have all of that be set in this moment is unique, but the sort of structure of this type of story is not.
For Dylan and Will, what films were you using as like touchstones for your documentary?
That's interesting. We didn't actually have it wasn't like we had a film that was the kind of Bible. This is the one that obviously we looked at films like Senna, for example, that in the when we first were conceiving this idea was purely archive film that we took in the moment at that time. But in terms of kind of references, we weren't really sort of looking at other films, I guess, in that way.
Yeah, I'd say like I think editorially, like it was taking ideas that would help. What we wanted people to leave this film with was that it's a film that you feel as much as it makes you think. And I think looking at the way that like Nick Rogue edits, for example, and that editing can be used as memory. That was kind of important to us, and building up these kind of associative images with Karen and different people, so that there was almost like a kind of visual signifiers that pulled you through the film. I think we followed our instincts really, and a lot of it was to do with like when we were getting archived through, because it was so dependent. Like we knew we kind of broke down the story way before we even started looking for archive, and we knew which stories we would follow, how they might intertwine. Our first version was a little bit too long, and we kept narrowing that down. But then you get to a stage where you'd be like, well, how do we tell this part of the story with the archive that's available to us? So we'd have to kind of adapt, and it became a process of sort of building it and rebuilding it and kind of shaving bits off and adding bits that come in unexpectedly at the last minute. but always with this aim. Like, we had an amazing team. I'd say this is the most collaborative project we've done, because in the past, we've gone and shot our documentaries. On this occasion, a lot of it was like detective work, looking for archive. And then it was kind of, big, long discussions about, how we could achieve our storytelling aims through the resources available to us. So, but always keeping an eye on, like, we want this to fit. We knew we wanted a feeling. I think that there were two quotes that, one was from a review in The Guardian over here for the book, which said a flashbulb moment before everything changed. And we knew that was very much a feeling that we wanted to create with the film. And the other was actually Lizzie's quote from the book, where she says, we were all chasing New York, and for a few magical years we caught it. And that was the sentiment, if you like, that we wanted to capture in the film, that feeling of the ephemeral nature of youth. And Albert says at the end of the film, we were all so innocent, and you spend so much time chasing that innocence, trying to get it back, and you can't. And I think that's tying into what Lizzie was saying about the coming of age nature of it. That was something we really, really wanted the theme of the film to be, that these are all kind of coming of age stories, but they also happen to take place at a point in time that was also, ephemeral. We can never go back to, the way the world is, weirdly more innocent, pre-technology, pre-phones, the political and cultural changes that have taken place. So I think there were lots of like mini references and influences, but there wasn't a template film that was something we were looking at. I guess the things like London, Babylon, and there's a whole bunch of like time and place films that through archive capture the essence of a period. But yeah, no one specific reference.
Yeah, I have to say, one of the things I loved, the moment I loved in the film was the take that you used from the Maps video, where it's just on Karen the whole time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's a brilliant video, but just to keep it on her and just to watch the full scope of the emotions was just, that was a really strong move. So much about this film is about, the power of youthful exploration, inspiration. Kind of to bring it full circle, what advice would you want to give to your younger self?
Go to New York earlier.
Then you couldn't have made this film because you would have been too close to it. So I'm not going to have no advice. There's a great moment in the book where Karen O is drunk at the cooler, and she's like crushed out on some guy, and she's like heartbroken for some reason. And she sees Debbie Harry at the bar, and she's like just kind of soused enough to go over and be like, Debbie Harry, oh my God, you're dead. She's like a kid. She's maybe still even in school. I don't know, very young. And before and everything. And she goes over to Debbie Harry, and she's kind of, like drunk girl at the bar, chatting her up and saying, man, boys and this and that and heartbreak and ambition and desire and all this stuff. And she finally says to her, or remembers saying to her, do you ever just feel like a girl in a boy's world? This is Debbie Harry. And Debbie Harry's like, honey, just enjoy it while it lasts. Just enjoy it while it lasts. And that scene is great for so many reasons. And it's great for Karen to be telling it. But there's nothing more torch passing than that moment to me, especially for women, especially in this very particular, often very male. Karen talks a lot in the film and generally about the specific experience of being the only girl in this room a lot of the time, this collective room. And I certainly felt that way. And Karen's role in representing herself and her art in the way that she did was so influential to me and to many others. Obviously, she's on the cover of the book. And I think about that all the time. I think one of the things, I've said this before, but one of the things I'm really grateful to Will and Dylan and the whole team that worked on this for capturing is something that allows all of us who lived through it to recognize that it was a really particular and special time, because you kind of sometimes miss that. And I think that's what that anecdote reveals. Like Debbie's like, dude, I am the model of everything you're chasing, and I am telling you, like, where you are right now is already it. Like, it's already it. You're having it right now. Even this sorrow is like part of the beautiful story that you've already achieved. And so I think that's what I would like my younger self to recognize, is like, I spent so much time being anxious that I wasn't there yet. And it's like, I was there the whole time.
And I wouldn't listen to any advice when I was younger, so I'd be wasting my breath.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Thank you guys so much for your time, and thank you for making the film. It was really, really enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.